merci beaucoup à tous les quatre pour les résultats de cette enquête en ligne. J'ai à présent le grand plaisir d'accueillir sur scène pour quelques mots de conclusion trois personnalités qui vont peut-être venir les unes après les autres. Tout d'abord, Monsieur l'ambassadeur Salman Bal, qui est avec nous. Vous êtes le directeur du CAGI, le Centre d'accueil pour la Genève internationale. Et merci beaucoup d'être avec nous sur scène.
Bonsoir, et merci pour l'opportunité de participer à cet événement. J'ai suivi la discussion avec beaucoup d'entrées. Merci beaucoup à tous les intervenants et intervenantes. Pour moi, la question, en fait, je vais peut-être prendre deux éléments. La mobilisation sociale. Bien sûr, moi, je pense que la mobilisation sociale, c'est une réalité qui a dans beaucoup de domaines, a eu un impact énorme sur notre vie quotidienne. Quand je me suis préparé pour cette réunion, il y a 2-3 événements qui, en fait, dont je me suis rappelé. D'abord, quand j'étais enfant, dans les années 80, le mouvement des partis verts, partout en Europe, la forêt était en grande difficulté, l'extinction de la forêt. Et en fait, ça a commencé avec une mobilisation vraiment sociale, ce qui a mené après à la création des partis verts, qui à nos jours, dans beaucoup de pays, sont dans le gouvernement. Donc, d'une mobilisation sociale est né un parti politique, un parti qui, dans beaucoup de pays, prend une responsabilité gouvernementale. Un autre événement dont je me suis aussi rappelé, c'est quand j'étais dans les vingtaines. C'était en fait la convention anti-mine personnelle. Aujourd'hui, on a parlé qu'à l'ONU, c'est difficile de changer des choses parce qu'il y a 193 États membres qui sont souvent contre des nouvelles initiatives. Mais en fait, cette mobilisation pour bannir les mines antipersonnelles a montré à quel niveau la société civile peut bouger des choses, peut changer les lois. Là, bien sûr, il y avait aussi l'élément clé qu'une personnalité comme la princesse Diane, qui était une figure clé de la campagne. Là aussi, mais ce qui était intéressant, cette mobilisation sociale, il n'y a pas eu de parti politique ou de mouvement politique. Mais ce qui était intéressant, c'est que d'autres initiatives ont essayé de copier cette mobilisation sociale, ce qui s'est passé. L'autre élément que je voulais aussi dire, c'était, plusieurs orateurs l'ont mentionné, le vote sur la loi CO2 qu'on a eu en Suisse il y a 2 semaines. Ce qui m'a étonné, c'est en fait, quand j'ai lu les analyses, qu'en fait, le groupe d'âge 35 ans et plus jeune était le groupe qui a rejeté la loi le plus fortement. Et ça m'a beaucoup étonné parce qu'en fait, ce mouvement environnemental climat qu'on vit depuis quelques années, Fridays for Future, on a eu les élections fédérales en Suisse où les partis verts ont gagné plusieurs pourcentages, sont devenus plus forts, où on avait l'impression qu'en fait la mobilisation sociale pour cette loi était là. Ce qui m'a étonné, c'est en fait pas le clivage intergénérationnel, mais interrégional. C'était le vote urbain contre le vote rural. Et c'est peut-être que là-dessus que j'aimerais terminer. J'ai l'impression, à nos jours, le dialogue intergénérationnel, on y arrive de mieux en mieux, mais quand je vois les référendums en Suisse, les votes en Suisse, on a de plus en plus un clivage, en fait, entre urbain et rural. Et peut-être que pour aussi faire un pont entre le rural et l'urbain, on devrait se faire inspirer par ce qui a été fait dans les débats intergénérationnels. Avec ça, je termine. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, monsieur l'ambassadeur. Merci beaucoup. Paul Lade est également avec nous. Paul Lade, vous êtes directeur de l'Institut de recherche des Nations Unies pour le développement social. Et je présente également Corinne Malvagnan qui nous a rejoint sur scène. Bonsoir madame, vous êtes directrice exécutive de la Fondation Kofi Annan. Paul Lade, on vous écoute pour quelques mots de conclusion.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing I'd like to say is it's been a really enjoyable set of panels, and I have loved hearing the stories. And I think for me, the inescapable conclusion is that the role of individuals, of people, of communities who are fighting for economic, social, environmental justice or human rights is so incredibly important in influencing the actions of those with power in governments, in the UN or elsewhere. That's my main conclusion. And in a moment, I want to talk specifically about how that engagement of civil society, of movements, of people, helped shape the SDGs. And I've got three very, I think, shocking examples of goals that wouldn't be in the SDGs if it wasn't for the engagement of civil society. But first, I work for a research institute based in Geneva. We concentrate on social policy that's connected to economic policy and environmental justice. It's called UNRIST. It's a very interesting bit of the UN because it's in the UN. Ultimately, we're responsible to member states, to governments, but actually our DNA, our makeup, our way of operating is very much based around what Richard called the second and third bits of the UN, and in particular the third bit of the UN. All of our work is with networks of practitioners, of academics, of campaigners, people in movements all around the world, but particularly in the global south, people who are working for economic justice, social justice, gender justice, fighting climate change and promoting environmental justice. And at the moment, all of our work is concentrated on overcoming inequalities and contributing to a dialogue on the new form of social contract that we need, in particular what we see as an eco-social contract. Back to my sort of shocking headlines of goals that didn't almost make it into the SDGs. My previous job before being director of UNRIST was, I was director of the MDGs in UNDP in New York. And when those were coming to an end, we strategized about how we could convert the progress that had been made on the MDGs, but also make them better and stop member states doing what they normally do, which is bringing everything down to the lowest common denominator when they negotiate. And it was clear that that was going to happen as they tried to replace the MDGs. So our strategy was to engage fully the third UN in contributing their ideas. We had dialogues running for 4 years all around the world on thematic issues. We had national level dialogues. We had a huge survey called My World that reached 10 million people around the world. And if those things hadn't have happened, then there are 3 goals that wouldn't have made it into the SDGs. And the first one is SDG 16 on governance, what is now called peaceful and inclusive societies. And in that survey of 10 million people, it didn't matter where you lived in the world, whether it was the UK or Kazakhstan or South Africa or Zambia, people were voting that they wanted an honest and responsive government. Now, governments don't like talking about governance because it can reflect badly on themselves, but there was no way that they could get out of including a goal broadly around governance because of civil society pressure. The second one is on inequalities. That would not have made it in there. And I say this not just out of sort of personal anecdote. I say this because of a very thorough, independent evaluation we did of the process afterwards. Gender equality would have made it in, but inequalities based around wealth and income are structural and systemic. And in a way, they're anathema to our capitalist system. And there is no way that governments would have reflected that in a set of goals that they would have had to abide by. The third one, and this is the punchline, is the goal on climate change. Governments fought to keep a goal on climate change out of the SDGs until civil society and academics threw their hands up in horror and said, how can you have an educational set of goals around the SDGs on sustainable development without including climate change? And those are 3 very, very concrete ways that civil society made sure that that agenda was not ridiculous in structure and outcome. And so the UN can play a role, and we talked about the convening role earlier, but when the UN plays its role well, its convening role well, it convenes with conviction and direction. And the direction is given by our charter, it's given by all the agreements on human rights that have been brokered by member states in the UN, and it's given direction by all the agreements on the environment that have taken place in the UN as well.
Merci beaucoup, Paul Ladd. Et le mot de la fin, j'ai le grand plaisir de le donner à Corinne Momal-Vagnan, directrice exécutive de la Fondation Kofi Annan. Merci d'être avec nous.
Merci beaucoup. Et puis je vais être brève parce qu'on a quand même le match France-Suisse tout à l'heure à 21h et je pense que beaucoup d'entre nous veulent être rentrés pour ça. Mais plus sérieusement, je veux remercier d'abord Grace Sales parce que ça a été vraiment une soirée extraordinaire. Moi, j'ai trouvé que tous les panels étaient très intéressants, y compris la présentation des résultats du questionnaire, du survey à la fin. J'espère qu'on aura ces résultats aussi quelque part par écrit, parce que j'aimerais vraiment avoir le temps de les regarder un peu plus profondément. Mais j'ai quelques réflexions à partager à la fin de cette soirée très riche avec vous, puis je vais le faire très rapidement en anglais. First of all, I think that this format of intergenerational dialogue is one that we must pursue and use more and more often. I can't tell you how many times I sat during 30 years at the United Nations in meetings where the youngest person was probably me, and even when I was in my early 50s, you know, so we really do need more youth input, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. This format of dialogue is essential, and I'm going to use a famous saying that has been attributed to Benjamin Franklin and also to Confucius by some weird, but it's probably apocryph, but this is what it is. It says, tell me and I will forget. Teach me and I may remember. Involve me and I will learn and understand. And this is really the point of involving young people in our actions and our dialogues. So thank you, Grace Sales, for, I mean, frankly, the first time I heard the term intergenerational dialogue was when Grace Sales organized their first one at the Palais des Nations a few years ago. So thank you very much. Myself, I have spent 3 hours this afternoon in another intergenerational dialogue that the Kofi Annan Foundation is organizing also with Grace Sales. So thank you, Grace Sales, for teaching me that this is a good format and this is what we need to do more. I was a bit surprised that the discussions didn't dwell at greater length on the COVID-19 crisis, which is so present in our lives and our minds. Yes, it was about the planet and it was about the climate change, but I do think that, I think it was Gabriel only who talked about the leadership shown or not shown during the COVID crisis. I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a real-time test, a real-life test of how mankind can react to crisis. And it is really interesting to analyze leadership during this crisis and what that can mean for future decisions on climate change. And frankly, I would give mankind a C- on the pandemic so far, because there have been some good things happening and some not such good things happening. But overall, society has held together, and which is amazing considering that many of our social fabric was already fragilized, made much more fragile by inequalities over the last 20 years. Yet societies have mostly held up during the crisis, which I think in itself is an achievement. We have had amazing achievements in the field of vaccines, for instance. And people, all the people, have more or less behaved well, which is amazing when you think of all the constraints that were put on people. So I do think that there are some good things that came out, that there's enormous resilience that was shown during the crisis. And yet, I agree with Gabriel, I think that said, leadership was not, some of the leadership that came through was not very encouraging. Someone did mention the access to vaccines, and that is really very shameful what is happening with the lack of access to vaccines in the global south. So I would say that there are loads of lessons to be drawn from the COVID crisis, also in terms of social mobilization, by the way. So I am a bit worried about a number of things that were said today and that I have observed in the last few years, is the fact that, and we heard it, especially in the first and third panels, about continued exclusion. And this came through also during the COVID-19 crisis. Here in Geneva, people were suddenly shocked that thousands of people were lining up to get a simple bag of groceries at the beginning of the crisis last year, if you remember. So I think this brought to light the fact that there are enormous inequalities, but continued exclusion. And I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see a real effort to bring in underrepresented groups into decision-making processes, including, I'm going to be very frank, including at the United Nations. I left the United Nations, so I can be more open now, but including at the United Nations, where in particular, young voices are not heard. Very clearly, they are not heard. We have made a lot of progress in increasing representation of women at the United Nations, but even then, there are still strong undercurrents of discrimination, including against women. But it's not only the United Nations, in all big multilateral decision-making organizations. So I am worried about continued exclusion from decision-making institutions at local, national, and international levels. I am worried about, in fact, the lack of social mobilization on certain themes. I think, in fact, in climate change, there is social mobilization, and that's wonderful, and that is driven by young people. I am very surprised to see, as compared to maybe 30, 40 years ago, the lack of social mobilization with regard to some extreme violence that's being brought on certain populations, like, for instance, at the moment in Ethiopia. Nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about what's happening in Tigray. So I am worried that there is a certain apathy with among us in our societies on certain themes, less on others. And of course, climate change is the prime issue that we need to work on, but it's not the only one, and everything is linked. So accepting that some groups are excluded, accepting violence against some groups is not going to help us, in fact, fight climate change. So I think that's worrying. I'm worried also, and someone mentioned it, I think it may have been Chantal, about the shrinking space for civil society in some of our countries and in some of our organizations. I have to tell you that I was fighting very hard at the Palais des Nations to preserve the right for NGOs to meet at the Palais des Nations, because there was, without the authorization of some member states. And there was a big push from many member states to reduce to make sure that NGOs could only meet with the authorization of, with the sponsorship of a member state, which would defeat the whole purpose. So this, we managed to hold off this decision for now, but there is a systematic push to reduce the space, the capacity of civil society to mobilize. So this is worrying. Nevertheless, because I'm an optimist, I want to end on a positive note. I'm very, very hopeful because of what I see in the younger generation, because of what the extraordinary things that have been achieved by the people that were here tonight, including, for instance, Andrea in Mexico, in making sure that this law passed for the protection of domestic workers, but everybody else who was here. And all the examples I heard this afternoon earlier with the Kofi Annan changemakers, these young people that we are also having a dialogue with. So I'm very hopeful. I see it in my own children who are in their 20s. The values of the young generation are all right. They want the right thing. they still don't always mobilize. Many do, but they prefer to do it in the street rather than through our traditional structures of political parties, which are not civil society organizations, I have to say. So there is the right attitude, the extraordinary awareness in the young generation. However, there is this does not translate at the polls. There is great apathy towards politics, and that is a shame, because in many countries, that's the way you can make things move. And I think, as was said also earlier, you need both. You need movements in the street, and you need people to vote the right way. So I think, if the young people can do this extra step, then we really will have the solutions we need. And I'm very hopeful, because they are an extraordinary generation that is really, really committed to positive change. So thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Merci Corinne Momalvagnan. Et puis merci à toutes et tous. Alejandro Bonillo Garcia va nous rejoindre sur la scène pour quelques mots. Venez seulement, Monsieur le Président. Moi, j'aimerais juste vous remercier de votre attention, remercier toutes les personnes qui ont participé à l'organisation de cette soirée. Et puis un merci tout particulier, on les salue, Émilie Ferreira et Sarah Maclay. C'était nos interprètes de la soirée, on peut les applaudir, elles ont très bien travaillé. Ainsi que l'équipe technique en régie qu'on peut applaudir également.
Oui. Bon, merci beaucoup à vous tous. On a passé 3 heures ici vraiment merveilleuses. On a beaucoup appris, j'ai beaucoup appris. Ça m'a rappelé des missions que j'avais en République dominicaine où il y avait 2 panneaux. Un panneau qui disait « Il y a quelque chose de pire à avoir un cancer ». Et on passait 2, 3, 4 kilomètres, il y avait un autre panneau. Pire qu'avoir un cancer, c'est d'avoir un cancer et de ne pas savoir qu'on a un cancer. Alors maintenant, on sait qu'on a des problèmes, on n'a pas toutes les solutions, mais il y a des gens comme vous, passionnés, avec talent, avec force, avec passion, qui travaillent pour trouver les réponses. Merci beaucoup pour une journée vraiment mémorable pour Gary Sells. Merci, Madame Momalvagnan. On est vraiment ravis de collaborer avec la Fondation Kofi Annan. Merci beaucoup, ambassadeur Salman Bal, pour l'accueil que vous donnez tous les jours à Kaji. Merci beaucoup, monsieur le directeur du Centre de recherche des Nations Unies, Paul Ladd, pour votre participation. Et surtout, je voudrais remercier, en plus de l'équipe technique qui est là-haut, Jérémy Sédou, qui nous a conduit merveilleusement, encore une fois, sur un... Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup à tous et bonne soirée.